A black businessman, exhausted from a week of high-stakes negotiations, finally lands back home, ready to embrace the comfort of familiar streets. But the moment he steps into the airport, everything changes. A security officer, eyes filled with quiet suspicion, singles him out. No reason, no explanation, just an unspoken assumption. The questioning begins, his ID scrutinized as if it were counterfeit, his bags inspected with an edge of doubt no other passenger around him seems to face. The humiliation is public, the whispers, the sideways glances, the silent verdicts from onlookers. They see it, but no one intervenes. Then, in a twist no one expected, a senior executive from the airline steps forward. The security officer, certain of his authority, makes a final mistake, one that costs him his job just 7 minutes later. What happened next? It set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. It begins, as these things always do, with a look, not a word, not a gesture, just a fraction of a second where judgment crystallizes behind the eyes of the observer. Isaiah Coleman feels it before he even reaches the boarding gate. A familiar shift in the air, a tightening, a sense of expectation. He is a man used to walking into rooms where people do not know what to do with him. A man who carries himself too large, too dark, too unmistakable in spaces designed for smaller men. Men of a different shade. The airport hums with the quiet choreography of travel. Suitcases rolling over polished floors. Voices murmuring in hushed tones. Flight attendants moving with mechanical precision. And yet, there is a rhythm beneath it all. An unspoken understanding of who belongs where. Isaiah moves through it with ease. His steps measured, unhurried. He carries nothing but a single bag slung over his shoulder. Worn at the edges but sturdy. His clothes are simple. A hoodie, sneakers, jeans. He has dressed this way on purpose. Because today, he is not here as Isaiah Coleman the businessman, the former athlete, the investor in Horizon Air. Today, he is here to observe. The woman at the first-class gate is Rebecca Whitmore, a flight attendant with the sharp efficiency of someone who has spent years curating an experience for the right kind of passengers. Her hair is neat, her uniform crisp, her eyes constantly scanning. She is not cruel. No, cruelty is too obvious, too impolite. But she is precise. And when she sees Isaiah approaching, something flickers across her face. A quiet calculation, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. She steps forward, her posture straightening, her expression tightening ever so slightly. Sir, this line is for first-class passengers. There is no overt hostility in her tone. It is even, professional, but it carries the weight of an unwritten rule. This is not for you. Isaiah does not react. Not yet. He has lived too long. Seen too much. To be surprised. He reaches into his pocket. Pulls out the first-class ticket. Holds it up between his fingers. Rebecca hesitates. Not because she thinks he is lying, but because she had already decided who he was before the facts could interfere. The scanner beeps. Green light. A small shift in her face. A recalibration. An attempt to smooth over the moment. Enjoy your flight, she says, but the words do not carry the same ease. The same practiced warmth she has offered to the man in the navy suit. The woman draped in pearls. Isaiah steps past her without a word, feeling the weight of her stare on his back. And so it begins. A story Isaiah has lived 1,000 times before. A story about power, perception, and the spaces that people like him are always being told, explicitly or otherwise, that they do not belong in. What Rebecca does not know, what none of them know yet, is this. Isaiah is not just a passenger. He is the owner. And today, he is not just taking a flight. He is taking notes. Isaiah settles into his seat. But he does not relax. He never does. Not in places like these. The first-class cabin is a study in quiet opulence. Leather seats that cradle passengers in comfort. Warm towels folded with care. The soft murmur of attendants ensuring that every need is met before it is even spoken. A world designed for ease. For assumption. For expectation. And yet, in spaces like these, Isaiah knows that expectation is a fragile thing, built on centuries of knowing who is supposed to sit where. He does not expect trouble. But he expects something. And he is not disappointed. The first sign is hesitation. The moment when Rebecca Whitmore, the same flight attendant who had questioned him at the gate, moves through the aisle, handing out champagne, offering warm smiles, engaging in quiet conversation with the passengers she has already deemed worthy of it. She moves with the ease of someone who understands how to reinforce the social order without ever having to say a word. She leans toward a man in a tailored suit. Her voice warm. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carpenter. Yours?" He nods. And without asking, she pours him a glass of champagne, placing it delicately on his tray. She moves to a woman draped in silk and pearls. "Would you care for a glass of Dom Perignon, ma'am?" The woman accepts with a smile, lifting the glass as if this moment is part of a routine as old as time. And then, Rebecca reaches him. Isaiah watches her hesitate for just a fraction of a second. So brief that another man might have missed it. So quickly smoothed over that it could be mistaken for nothing. But Isaiah sees it. She does not lean in the way she had before. She does not assume to know his preferences. Instead, her tone shifts. A polite distance creeping into her voice. A reservation that was not there moments ago. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" "Not Mr. Coleman. Not your usual. Just sir." Isaiah meets her eyes. He does not smile. He does not let her off the hook. "Champagne." There is no hostility in his voice. No visible challenge. Just the weight of expectation. Rebecca nods, quickly pouring the drink. Her hands are steady, but her eyes flicker with something else. Something that has no name but is unmistakable all the same. Isaiah takes the glass but does not sip. He simply watches her. And she knows it. She turns away quickly, back to the comfort of passengers whose presence does not disrupt the rhythm of the world she understands. Isaiah takes a slow breath. There is nothing here that he has not seen before. Nothing that surprises him. But that does not make it any less exhausting. To exist in a space where people like him have always been treated as intruders. To navigate the weight of a million assumptions without ever losing his composure. But this, too, is part of the game. He leans back in his seat, fingers tapping against the armrest, watching as Rebecca continues moving through the cabin, effortlessly slipping back into her role, comfortable again now that the moment has passed. She thinks it is over. But it is only just beginning. The flight hums along, steady and controlled, like the unspoken rules that govern places like this. Isaiah sits still, but his mind is always moving. He has learned, after a lifetime of watching, that the smallest shifts in tone, in posture, in silence, tell the whole story. He sees it now, unfolding around him. Rebecca Whitmore, the flight attendant who had hesitated with him, moves through the cabin with a seamless grace that is reserved for those who belong. She glides past him again, stopping at the seat in front of him, where a white man in a linen blazer, mid-40s, the kind of man who speaks with an effortless confidence, leans back, tapping a finger against his armrest. "Excuse me, miss," he calls, his voice light but expectant. "Can I get another?" Rebecca turns immediately, all warmth and attentiveness. She nods before he even finishes his sentence. "Of course, sir." Isaiah watches her pour another glass of champagne with practiced ease. Watches the way the man doesn't even look at her as she hands it to him. Already turning back toward the in-flight movie as if service is not a privilege but a certainty. Rebecca lingers for just a second, almost waiting for some acknowledgement. But when she gets none, she simply moves on, her face unchanged, unbothered. Then, she reaches Isaiah's row again. This time, she does not stop. She walks past him as if he isn't there. As if she has already checked off his presence. Already given him what she believes he deserves. It is not a mistake. It is a quiet decision. Isaiah lets the moment pass. But he knows the game. Knows that power in places like this is not about what is said but about what is withheld. So he waits. The moment comes soon enough. The elderly white man across the aisle. Distinguished. Silver-haired. The kind of man who has never had to ask twice for anything. Adjusts his reading glasses and glances toward Rebecca. "Miss, Do you mind? I'd like some tea. Rebecca smiles immediately. Of course, sir. I'll bring it right over. Isaiah turns slightly, his voice measured, steady. I'll take some as well. Rebecca does not react at first. For a moment, it is as if she had not heard him at all. Then, she nods, quickly, stiffly. I'll see if we have more. And she walks away. Isaiah knows what this means. Knows that in places like this, service is an unspoken hierarchy. A careful balancing act where some receive attention without effort, while others are left to prove, again and again, that they are worthy of the same courtesy. It is a lesson he has learned since childhood. The subtle delay at the department store checkout. The extra glance at the restaurant before the waiter comes over. The way a cab's light dims just before reaching him. The silent, lingering question. Do you belong here? Isaiah leans back, waiting. He does not expect the tea to come quickly. And it doesn't. 10 minutes pass. Then 15. Rebecca moves through the cabin, serving others with practiced ease. But the tea did not come. Isaiah knows this game, and he has never played it quietly. So, when Rebecca finally passes by again, he lifts his gaze, meets her eyes directly, and asks, not loud, not angry, but in a voice that leaves no room for avoidance. Miss Whitmore, do you still need to check if there's more tea? Rebecca's face shifts. The game has been called. Passengers nearby glance over, some curious, some indifferent, some suddenly more interested in their reading materials. Rebecca hesitates. And in that hesitation, Isaiah sees the truth of it. She had not forgotten. She had not checked. She had simply decided that he could wait. Or that he did not need it at all. The realization flickers across her face. But she catches herself quickly. Her voice is smooth, her tone controlled. My apologies, sir. I'll bring it right away. She turns swiftly, disappearing toward the galley. And Isaiah exhales, slow and deep. Because it is not about the tea. It never was. It is about the quiet divide. The weight of the unspoken. The way a moment like this is both insignificant and everything at once. And Isaiah knows, as he waits for the tea, that this flight is far from over. The tea arrives, finally, set down with careful hands and an apology that does not quite meet the eyes. Isaiah thanks her voice even though the weight of the moment lingers between them. He lets the heat from the cup rise, curling into the space between them like a ghost of something unsaid. Rebecca does not stay to see if he takes the first sip. She is already moving on. Already slipping back into the rhythm of the cabin, where things are easier left unexamined. Isaiah has known people like her all his life. Not bad people, not outright hostile, just believers in a system they do not question. Enforcers of a world they did not build but have grown comfortable maintaining. And it is that, not cruelty, but comfort, that makes the world turn the way it does. The plane hums along, smooth and steady, but the atmosphere has shifted. Small things, barely noticeable to most passengers who look at him, then quickly away. The slight hush that follows when someone realizes he is watching. Isaiah does not need to guess why. He has upset the balance. He was supposed to take the silence. He was supposed to absorb the slight. To fold into himself and let the moment pass without protest. Because that is how it is done. For centuries. For generations. Take it, don't name it. If you do, you are not just a man asking for tea. You are the problem. Isaiah sips slowly, his fingers steady around the porcelain, feeling the weight of it. It tastes no different than any other tea he has had. But something in it still sits heavy. Across the aisle, the elderly white man who had ordered his own tea just before him clears his throat. His eyes flick toward Isaiah, then back to the book in his hands. Then he speaks. It's just a drink, son. No need to make a fuss. The words are soft, meant to be received as gentle, as reasonable, as a lesson from an older man to a younger one. Even though Isaiah is no boy, no son of his, Isaiah lets them settle, untouched, before lifting his gaze. It always is. The man blinks, confused. Isaiah leans forward slightly, voice even but firm. It's always just something. A drink, a seat, a question. He tilts his head. And yet, it's never small, is it? The man exhales through his nose. shifting in his seat. Now, I didn't mean anything by it, he says, his voice dipping into the familiar tone of white discomfort. That quick retreat, that sudden shift into defensiveness. As if Isaiah had reached across the aisle and shoved the words into his mouth. Isaiah doesn't smile, doesn't soften. That's the part you don't understand. He holds the man's gaze steady, until the older passenger finally looks away. And that is that. But the moment does not leave the air. It lingers. It spreads. Rebecca has seen the exchange. Though she pretends not to. Other passengers, too, pretend they did not hear. Did not see. That it is easier not to notice when something does not involve them. But Isaiah has already broken the rule. He has stepped over the invisible threshold. And he knows, deep in his bones, that there is no going back. Not on this flight. Not ever. The world does not like to be disturbed. It prefers its illusions intact. Its hierarchy unshaken. Its politeness untested. Isaiah knows this as well as he knows his own name. And yet, here he is, sitting in a seat that was paid for. Drinking tea that was finally served. Existing where some people believe he should not be. The air inside the cabin has shifted. Subtle but undeniable. The first-class passengers, those wrapped in silk scarves and expensive timepieces, those whose presence is never questioned, are uncomfortable, not because Isaiah has done anything wrong, but because he has refused to accept being done wrong. This, of course, is a greater crime than any actual wrongdoing. Rebecca, the flight attendant, pretends to be busy at the service station, but Isaiah catches her watching him in the reflection of a polished surface. She is nervous. Afraid of what? That he will demand more than what he has already taken. His dignity? Isaiah exhales, slow and steady. He has no interest in turning this flight into a spectacle. But he also knows he is no longer in control of that decision. Across the aisle, the elderly white man who chastised him earlier now leans toward another passenger. Speaking in the low, conspiratorial voice of a man who believes his words are not for Isaiah's kind. Just saying, back in my day, people knew their place. Isaiah does not flinch. He has heard those words before. They were in his grandfather's stories. Laced into his father's lessons. Whispered in the undertones of a world that still refuses to say them aloud but never stopped believing them. They were there in the separate water fountains. The back entrances. The lowered eyes. And they are here, now, on this plane, at this moment. The irony, of course, is that Isaiah has spent his life knowing his place. His place has been at the bottom of expectations and the top of suspicion. His place has been questioned in boardrooms and backrooms. In interviews and invitations. In stores where the security guard follows just a step too close. His place, always, has been in the crosshairs of doubt. And yet, here he is, sitting, existing, unapologetically. The flight continues. But Isaiah feels the slow turn of the knife. The resentment of those who believe respect is a privilege they bestow, rather than a right he owns. And then, it happens. Rebecca returns. But her smile is tighter. Her voice laced with something unreadable. Or perhaps, Isaiah simply knows how to read too well. Sir, she says, voice even. The captain has asked to speak with you. There it is. The unspoken consequence. Isaiah looks at her for a long moment. Then sets his tea down. Untouched. The storm has finally arrived. There is a war happening. It is not loud. It does not come with the sound of gunfire or the clash of metal. It is quiet, polite. The kind of war that has been waged for centuries. Not on battlefields, but in offices, in storefronts, in places where a black man's presence is enough to tilt the balance of comfort. Isaiah is standing now, not because he has done anything wrong, but because he has been summoned. By the captain. By authority. The air in the first-class cabin is thick with something unspoken. The passengers are pretending to be uninterested. But Isaiah knows better. They are watching. Waiting to see what happens when a man like him, sitting in a place like this, is called to account for himself. Rebecca, the flight attendant, shifts uncomfortably as he rises. He wonders if she expected him to protest, to argue, to make a scene. That would have made it easier for her. Wouldn't it? A raised voice. A clenched fist. Then she could say she was right all along. That he didn't belong. But Isaiah has long since learned that the battlefield was never meant to be fair. So, he does not fight. He walks through the aisle, past the rows of passengers who pretend not to see him, past the old man who muttered about knowing your place, past the woman who had clutched her purse a little tighter when he first sat down. He walks with dignity, and it is this, his calm, his refusal to bend, that makes them even more uneasy. Rebecca leads him to a narrow corridor near the cockpit, where another flight attendant stands stiffly, avoiding his gaze. Then, the captain appears. He is an older man, graying at the temples, with the assured posture of someone who has never had to justify his place in the world. His uniform is crisp, his authority absolute. Sir, the captain says, as if Isaiah is already guilty of something. We've had a report of a disturbance. A disturbance. The word settles between them like a knife laid gently on the table. Isaiah does not react. He knows what this is. Knows that his presence alone is the disturbance. That his refusal to bow his head, to shrink, to disappear into the background, that is the crime. May I ask what the disturbance is? Isaiah says, his voice even. The captain glances at Rebecca. She looks away. We just need to ensure that all passengers are having a comfortable experience. The captain continues. There were concerns. Concerns. Another word, sharpened by years of history. Isaiah does not ask whose concerns. He does not ask if there was a formal complaint. Because he already knows the answers. He remembers his grandfather's stories of sundown towns and men who disappeared because someone was concerned. He remembers his own father, who was once asked by a manager to leave a department store. Not because he stole anything, but because his presence made the white customers uneasy. And here, now, miles above the ground, Isaiah sees the same thing unfolding in front of him. The battlefield has changed, but the war is still the same. So, Isaiah does what men like him have done for generations. He makes a choice. To stand tall. To speak plainly. To let the truth settle like thunder in the bones of those who wish to deny it. If someone has a problem with me sitting in the seat I paid for, Isaiah says, his voice calm, perhaps they should be the ones answering questions. Not me. The words hang in the air. Rebecca shifts uncomfortably. The second flight attendant looks away. And the captain, who has likely never had a passenger say this to him before, does not know what to say. Because Isaiah is not apologizing. He is not pleading. He is standing. And suddenly, the quiet war is not so quiet anymore. The silence that follows Isaiah's words is not a silence of peace. It is the silence before a storm. Rebecca stiffens, her fingers curling into a fist at her side. Though she quickly releases it. The captain exhales sharply, glancing toward the other flight attendant, as if expecting them to intervene. But no one moves. Isaiah has placed something heavy in the space between them. Something undeniable. And the weight of it, the truth of it, has made them all uneasy. A man like Isaiah was not supposed to talk back. He was not supposed to challenge authority. He was supposed to be grateful that he was allowed to exist here at all. And yet, here he stands, unmoved, unbroken, behind the captain. The narrow hallway opens back into the first-class cabin, where eyes are watching. The passengers, who, just minutes ago, had been enjoying their warm towels and glasses of wine, now pretend to be indifferent. Yet their ears are keen, their gazes darting cautiously from behind books and magazines. Isaiah knows how this moment feels to them. An intrusion, a crack in their perfectly curated world of comfort. But comfort, Isaiah knows, is a privilege, and privilege is a thing guarded fiercely. He has seen this before. The slow, building panic when the illusion of order is disturbed. When someone refuses to shrink. Refuses to apologize for simply existing in a space others believe does not belong to them. And so the moment stretches. Tight and brittle, waiting for someone to break it. The captain clears his throat. Sir, I need you to understand that we have policies to ensure that all passengers have a safe and pleasant experience. Isaiah lets the words settle before answering. And do those policies include questioning passengers who've done nothing wrong? The captain shifts his stance, his lips pressing into a thin line. Rebecca finally speaks. her voice sharper than before. We had multiple concerns from passengers who, quote, Isaiah cuts her off, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a finality that demands attention. Passengers who, his voice is low, measured, passengers who were uncomfortable with my presence, or passengers who actually witnessed me doing something inappropriate. He tilts his head slightly, watching her flinch at the precision of his words. Because they both know the answer. Because they both know this has nothing to do with rules, nothing to do with behavior, and everything to do with the fact that a black man in first class is a question mark some people cannot accept. The tension shifts now, not in Isaiah's direction, but against them, because the truth has been spoken, and there is no unspeaking it. Rebecca's gaze flickers toward the first-class cabin, where a few of the passengers have stopped pretending to ignore the situation. A middle-aged woman in a pearl necklace shifts uncomfortably in her seat. A businessman clears his throat and looks out the window, unwilling to engage. And then there is the older man in the navy blue suit. The same one who had muttered under his breath when Isaiah first took his seat. He watches the scene unfold with something like satisfaction. A man who has played this game before. A man who knows how these stories usually end. Isaiah can see it written on his face. Soon. They will ask you to move. Soon. They will ask you to leave. Soon. You will be reminded that no matter how much money you have, no matter how polite you are, no matter how calmly you speak, there are some doors that were never meant for you to walk through. And yet, Isaiah does not move. He does not give them the satisfaction of retreat. The captain exhales through his nose. He is thinking, calculating. He does not want this to escalate. Because escalation means attention. Escalation means complaints. Escalation means consequences. The airline does not want bad press. Isaiah knows this. And so he stands in the storm and waits. Because it is not his storm to carry. Because it is theirs. Because they must now decide whether to double down on their mistake or admit, in front of everyone, that they had no right to question him in the first place. The air feels heavier now. Charged with something unspoken. Something electric. Rebecca's lips press into a thin line. The captain looks away. And then, at last, he speaks. There's no problem. The words feel forced, strained, but they are spoken. Isaiah does not smile, does not gloat. He only nods, then turns and walks back to his seat, back to his place among those who had hoped he would disappear. And as he sits, as he feels the weight of their silent stares, he knows the war is not over. But today, in this moment, he has won. Isaiah sat still in his seat, his breath even, his hands relaxed on the armrests. But inside, something burned. The battle was over, for now, but the war, the real war, never ended. He could feel it in the weight of the silence, in the stiff postures of the passengers who had watched the confrontation unfold but had chosen, consciously, to do nothing. He could feel it in the way Rebecca moved past him now. Her steps clipped, her hands gripping the service tray just a little too tight. Her smile, when she offered drinks to other passengers, just a little too forced. She had lost, but he had not won. Because this was not a game. This was his life. The plane cruised at altitude. The sky outside endless, infinite. A flight attendant, not Rebecca, offered him a drink. He declined. He had no appetite for hospitality that had come too late. Instead, he let his eyes move through the cabin. The older man in the navy blue suit, the one who had muttered when Isaiah first took his seat, had turned away, staring out the window now as if the clouds were more interesting than the man sitting across the aisle. The woman in pearls clutched the handle of her purse a little too tightly. A nervous tick she likely wasn't even aware of. A few rows ahead, a younger man, probably in his late 20s, sharp suit, well-groomed, offered Isaiah a brief nod. A silent acknowledgement. One of the few. Isaiah was tired. Not the kind of tiredness that sleep could fix. A different kind of tiredness. A tiredness that lived in the bones. A tired person that was older than him. Older than his father. Older than his father's father. A tiredness that came from having to justify, over and over again, the right to exist without suspicion. The right to sit where he had paid to sit. The right to move through the world without someone demanding he prove himself worthy of simple human dignity. The right to breathe without apology. A ding from the overhead speaker. The pilot's voice, warm, professional, announcing their descent into the city. Isaiah closed his eyes for a moment, listening, not just to the words, but to the undertones, the shifting of bodies, the unbuckling of seatbelts too early, the impatience of people who had never known what it was to wait for permission. When he opened his eyes again, Rebecca was standing a few feet away, hesitating, the tray clutched in her hands. She looked at him, and for the first time since this flight had begun, there was uncertainty in her expression. Regret? No. Regret was an admission of wrongdoing, and Isaiah knew better than to expect that. But something else, something close. She took a breath, parted her lips, and then, at the last second, she changed her mind. She said nothing. She turned and walked away. The plane landed smoothly, the engines humming as it taxied toward the gate. Isaiah did not rush to stand. He waited as the people who had judged him, openly and in silence, gathered their designer bags and briefcases, eager to step off the plane and return to their lives. Waited as they avoided his gaze. Waited as Rebecca did her final checks, still refusing to look him in the eye. When he finally stood, stretching his shoulders, adjusting his cuffs, he did not move with anger. He moved with certainty. He was not small. He was not ashamed. He had paid for this seat. And the price of the ticket was more than just money. As he walked toward the exit, a voice stopped him. Not Rebecca. Not the captain. But the young man in the sharp suit. The one who had nodded at him before. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice low, respectful. I just wanted to say. I saw what happened back there." Isaiah turned to him. "I saw it too," Isaiah said. The young man swallowed, as if the words he wanted to say were struggling to make their way out. But finally, he found them. It wasn't right. Isaiah exhaled slowly. "No," he said, his voice even. "It wasn't." A pause. The young man hesitated, then extended his hand. Isaiah looked at it. And then, after a beat, he shook it. Not because the handshake would change anything, but because some wars are not won with battles. Some wars are won with witnesses. With the quiet, growing refusal to pretend that nothing is wrong. With the slow, painful transformation of truth into action. Isaiah released the handshake, nodded once, and stepped off the plane. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky was the color of fire. And Isaiah walked into it. Into the world. Into whatever fight would come next. Because the war was not over. But neither was he.